What happens when ideological opposites are forced to share the same stage? And what erupts when that stage is set not for dialogue, but for a public takedown? The night Ben Shapiro walked onto The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, no one expected what was coming, least of all the audience. The stage shimmered under hot studio lights, laughter tracks primed and cameras humming. The audience packed the seats with eager anticipation, many unaware that tonight's guest would test the limits of civility on live television. Ben Shapiro, the fast-talking conservative firebrand, had agreed to appear, despite what his team later called obvious hostility baked into the booking. It was a gamble, but for Ben, calculated confrontation was part of the brand. Colbert, meanwhile, paced backstage. His writers had pitched a fairly conventional interview, but he wanted edge, wanted fire. "Let's not pull punches," he reportedly told his segment producer with a smirk. In the green room, Ben reviewed bullet points and sipped water, calm but alert. He had made one request: no gotcha questions about his family. That request, like so many things that night, would be ignored. As the band queued up and the audience clapped for Colbert's entrance, the trap was already tightening. What started as show business was about to become something much darker. Stephen Colbert walked onto the stage like a man holding court, basking in the warm applause that masked the chill in his intentions. The monologue was crafted with precision: topical humor, political jabs, and then the pivot. "Our next guest says facts don't care about your feelings," he said with a pause. "But let's test how he feels about being on my couch." It landed with the audience. Laughter, whistles, a few raised brows. But the mood backstage shifted. Ben Shapiro, watching the monitor, turned slightly toward his assistant. "That line wasn't cleared," he said flatly. "No anger yet. Just calculation." The warning flares had been fired. This wasn't just an interview, this was a setup. As the show went to its first commercial break, Colbert adjusted his tie and sat back at the desk. One of the producers leaned in. "Just remember, keep it lively." Colbert nodded but said nothing. When the cameras rolled again, Ben was introduced to thunderous applause. He stepped out, his trademark suit sharp, expression unreadable. He shook Colbert's hand, but only just. The grip was firm, the eye contact unflinching. The host offered a grin. Ben offered none. The clash had begun. The first two questions were textbook. Colbert asked about Ben's latest book and his views on media bias. Ben responded smoothly, citing statistics and case studies with his usual machine gun precision. But the audience's laughter wasn't entirely warm, it was edged, waiting for blood. Then came the pivot. Colbert leaned in. "You've made a career criticizing the left, universities, the media. But are you really offering solutions or just monetizing outrage?" The crowd let out a collective, "Oh!" Ben's jaw tightened. The camera caught it. His voice dropped half a register. "I'm offering answers that challenge your audience's assumptions. If that feels like outrage, maybe they should ask why." The studio buzzed. Some clapped, others booed. Colbert smirked, sensing his opening. "Touché," he said, "but let's not pretend your brand isn't built on conflict." Ben didn't blink. "And yours isn't?" For a second, the room froze. A heavyweight had just thrown a punch back, and it landed. By now, both men had dropped the pretense. What was supposed to be an engaging dialogue had turned into a thinly veiled chess match. But Colbert wasn't playing fair. "Let's talk about your views on marriage," he said abruptly, flipping through a card. "You've spoken out against same-sex marriage. Do you believe some families are less legitimate than others?" The shift was immediate. Ben sat up straighter. His face remained neutral, but the shift in posture was unmistakable, defensive, alert. "I believe in traditional definitions," he answered carefully. "That doesn't mean I deny anyone's humanity." But the trap had been set. Colbert pressed harder. "So you're saying some lives deserve less recognition under the law?" The audience was now restless. Some clapped, some murmured. The air was thick with conflict. Ben's response was clipped. "I'm saying you're framing a policy disagreement as bigotry, which is why these conversations fail." Colbert leaned back with a smirk, clearly pleased. But the crowd didn't laugh. They weren't sure what they were watching anymore. A comedy show? A courtroom? A takedown? Whatever it was, it had stopped being entertainment. It was war. At first, the studio audience didn't know how to react. They came expecting a sharp-witted Colbert show, clever barbs and clean takedowns. But what they were witnessing felt different. The laughter grew strained, then infrequent. The air tightened with every exchange. Ben, for all his polarizing reputation, remained composed. He didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch. His delivery stayed cold, surgical. And that's what made it unsettling. When Colbert accused him of using moral certainty to justify social regression, Ben responded, "You call it regression, I call it preservation. That's the real debate." No punchlines, just heat. Someone in the back row clapped, alone. Then silence. The producers looked around nervously. This wasn't the vibe they'd planned. It was supposed to be entertaining friction, not ideological trench warfare. Colbert tried to pivot with a joke. "You've got a way with words, Ben. Like a knife has a way with skin." The audience gave a cautious laugh, but Ben didn't bite. "Only if you're afraid of being cut." Another blow landed. The audience wasn't laughing now. They were watching. Behind the curtain, the tension was worse. Colbert's senior producer was pacing just off stage, headset buzzing with crosstalk. "Should we redirect?" someone asked over comms. "Or is this good TV?" The showrunner didn't answer. He was too busy watching the monitors, frozen on the tight shots of Colbert's twitching smile and Ben's motionless hands. In the control room, a staffer muted their mic and whispered, "He's not cracking." They meant Ben. Colbert had tried sarcasm, moral high ground, even passive aggression. Nothing fazed the guest. That rattled them more than if he'd lost it. The most dangerous opponent was the one who stayed calm under fire. A runner sprinted to the green room to update Ben's team. His assistant stood with arms crossed. "We knew this was coming," she said. "Let him finish what he started." On set, Colbert tossed his next card aside. He wasn't reading the prompter anymore. The battle had moved off script and the crew knew it. They weren't filming an interview, they were documenting a breakdown. Then came the moment everything changed. "Let's talk religion," Colbert said casually, though nothing about the tone was casual. "You're an Orthodox Jew. You believe in divine law, right? So how does that square with democracy?" Ben didn't flinch. "The same way your Catholicism squares with your liberalism," he replied. "Faith informs values. Values shape policy. That's not a contradiction. That's America." It should have ended there. But Colbert pushed further. "So when you speak about morality, are you quoting scripture or your own authority?" Ben paused for the first time, not to think, but to choose his words. "If I claimed moral authority, I'd be in your chair." The line hit hard. The audience inhaled audibly. Colbert's smile faltered. "Careful," he said, no longer joking. "You're implying I have none." Ben looked him dead in the eye. "You implied it first." The crew in the wings stood still, the cameras tight on both faces. Something bigger than a clash of opinions was unfolding. It wasn't a disagreement, it was a dissection. And the subject was Stephen Colbert. Stephen Colbert leaned in with the intensity of a man no longer playing a role. "Let's be real, Ben," he said, his voice cutting through the studio haze. "Isn't your entire worldview just an elaborate excuse for not evolving with the rest of us?" The audience, long trained to laugh on cue, hesitated. A few chuckled, unsure. But others felt it, that sharp shift from wit to personal attack. The lighting hadn't changed, but the mood had. Something colder had crept into the room. Ben didn't flinch. "If you call consistency regression," he replied, "then I suppose your version of evolution looks a lot like ideological entropy." It was clinical, sharp, and completely unshaken. He didn't raise his voice, didn't change posture. The calmness unnerved people. It didn't look like a debate anymore. It looked like an ambush, and Ben had come armored. Colbert, perhaps expecting a flustered guest, suddenly found himself face to face with someone who not only refused to crumble, but seemed to grow sharper under pressure. The audience shifted uneasily. Their expressions were no longer smiling, their applause tepid and confused. Colbert, sensing the discomfort, tried to pivot. "Well, I guess it's just easier when your views never have to change." But Ben's eyes narrowed just slightly. Or maybe it's harder when your beliefs are tethered to trending hashtags instead of principles. That one landed. It wasn't a zinger, it was a scalpel, and it made people wonder who was really under the spotlight now. The tightrope Colbert walked every night, between comic relief and pointed critique, snapped in half. His next question came out rushed, unfiltered. Why are you so obsessed with control, Ben? Control over gender? Control over speech? Over schools? Over narratives? His tone was no longer playful. It was accusatory. The crowd murmured. The camera zoomed in, catching every twitch of Colbert's jaw. Ben blinked once. Because without control, there's chaos, and people get hurt when the rules are rewritten by feelings rather than reason. The response was blunt, unsentimental, the kind that doesn't seek approval, only clarity. Colbert scoffed. That's a convenient way to avoid empathy. Ben looked directly at him. No, that's a responsible way to define truth. If we abandon truth for comfort, we lose both. The crowd erupted in half-hearted applause, less for agreement, more for the tension it released. Then Colbert lost it. His smile vanished. You think you're the smartest guy in the room, he snapped. Ben's reply was a whisper, but somehow louder than any shout. No, he said. I just know when the room is pretending. That line stopped everything. The crew, the band, even the audience. No one knew whether to laugh, clap, or wince. For the first time all night, Colbert looked like the guest. The cameras cut, but the moment didn't. In the seconds that followed, the show's carefully maintained illusion of polish shattered. Colbert stood quickly, tugging at his blazer with sudden frustration. He's hijacking the show, he muttered to a nearby producer, unaware, or uncaring, that his mic was still hot. Backstage staff exchanged looks. No one had seen him rattled like this. The writer's room stared silently at the monitors. Meanwhile, Ben remained seated at the desk, casually sipping water, posture unchanged. His calm presence only added fuel to Colbert's visible agitation. A crew member leaned into the control booth and whispered, "He's spiraling. Someone needs to reset him before we're live again." The showrunner, pale and tense, simply muttered, "Too late." The tension backstage was now matching the tension on stage. This was no longer a performance, it was a broadcast implosion unfolding in real time. When the break ended and the cameras snapped back on, the audience was still murmuring. Colbert forced a grin, his tone noticeably flatter. "We're back," he said, "still joined by Ben Shapiro." But his voice lacked confidence. Ben, on the other hand, remained composed, like he had been waiting for this collapse the entire time. The crowd noticed, the camera noticed, and eventually the internet would too. The studio lights came back up, but the warmth was gone. The audience clapped on cue, but even the applause sounded mechanical, like it knew it was covering for something broken. Stephen Colbert smiled thinly as the show returned from break. "We're back with Ben Shapiro," he said, his voice unusually subdued. He leaned back in his chair and added, "And it's been spirited." Ben simply nodded, hands clasped calmly in front of him. No smile, no retreat. Colbert attempted levity. "Tell me, Ben, do you ever just turn it off? Relax, have a drink, maybe watch a rom-com?" The audience chuckled, grateful for something that sounded like a joke. Ben tilted his head slightly, answering with perfect deadpan, "Relaxation is a luxury for civilizations not in decline." It wasn't funny, but it hit like a punchline. Laughter turned into scattered applause. Colbert blinked. He had tried to pivot. Ben had flipped the script again. The host shifted forward, eyebrows raised. "Are you suggesting America is in decline?" Ben didn't hesitate. Yes, politically fragmented, morally disoriented, economically irresponsible. What would you call it? Colbert opened his mouth to respond, but paused. The studio, usually so responsive to every twitch of his expression, was silent. This wasn't the kind of rhythm late-night television thrived on. This was ideological sandpaper, abrasive, slow, real. Trying again to reset the tone, Colbert reached for his next card but didn't look at it. "Okay," he said, voice tight. "Then why come here, Ben? Why come on this show knowing you'd be challenged?" Ben's answer was swift and clinical. Because millions of people watch you and assume you're asking the right questions. Someone has to model what a real answer sounds like. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The shift was complete now. Colbert wasn't hosting, he was defending. The show had stopped being a format and had become a forum. He glanced at the teleprompter. The segment was supposed to be winding down. The timing was blown. Producers behind the cameras made frantic gestures, but no one moved. Because the real show wasn't the scripted one anymore, it was the unraveling of it. Colbert sat back in his chair and let out a quiet breath, almost a sigh. "You've got guts," he admitted, "coming in here, saying all this. But don't mistake this stage for your pulpit." Ben nodded once, not taking the bait. "I don't need a pulpit," he said. "I just need your cameras on." It was a devastating line, not shouted, but etched in confidence. A final crack of thunder before the real storm began. Because the next question Colbert would ask, off-script, unvetted, and deeply personal, would finally break whatever thin veneer of civility remained. And when it did, the consequences wouldn't just echo through the studio. They'd shake the entire media landscape. It was a moment that didn't come from the cue cards, the teleprompter, or the rehearsed flow of the show. It came from impulse, from ego. Stephen Colbert sat upright, eyes locked on Ben Shapiro with a look that was part curiosity, part challenge, and entirely deliberate. He held up a finger as if to signal something important. "Ben," he said, voice low and weighted, "you speak often about traditional values, family, and faith, but can I ask something personal?" The studio tensed. Ben didn't move. "Depends what you mean by personal," he replied. The response was controlled, but the message was clear. "Proceed carefully." Colbert ignored it. "You've been criticized for your comments about LGBTQ communities, for your positions on gender roles, on parenting, on religious doctrine. So here's my question. What would you do if one of your own children came out as gay or transgender? Would your values still hold then?" The audience gasped. Audible, sharp. Ben's face hardened, but not in anger, in restraint. For a brief second, the stoicism cracked, not from emotion, but from the weight of choosing a response. When he spoke, it was slow and deliberate. "I would love my child unconditionally, but I would not abandon my principles to gain applause. That's the difference between me and you, Stephen. I don't tailor truth to comfort." The words were like ice, slicing through the fake warmth of stage lights and painted smiles. Colbert didn't respond immediately. The room was frozen. Even the cameras hesitated in their movements. On the control board, someone muttered, "We've lost the crowd." They hadn't really lost them, they'd stunned them. The applause sign didn't light up. The band didn't cue music. All that existed was the silence between two men who no longer respected each other, if they ever did. Colbert finally exhaled. "That's a convenient answer," he said, forcing a tight smile. "But I wonder if it's one you'd stand by when it's your child crying at the dinner table." Ben didn't blink. "And I wonder if you'd stand by anything if the applause stopped." The studio trembled, and not metaphorically. The reaction was split. Some cheered, others booed. But nobody was silent anymore. The tension had become participatory. The producers backstage were in full crisis mode. Phones buzzed, floor managers waved off assistants, and the showrunner whispered, "We're not cutting, we're documenting." This is no longer just television. The guest had taken control, and the host had gambled too far. This wasn't an interview anymore, it was a moment. A confrontation that had surpassed ideological sparring and landed in the gut of something raw. What do you stand for when your principles cost you comfort, applause, and social acceptance? For Ben, it was a line in the sand. For Colbert, it was a miscalculation. For the audience, it was unforgettable. And for the internet, it was about to explode. Within minutes of the show airing, clips began circulating online. But not the clips the network had approved or scheduled for upload. These came from phones, shaky, unfiltered, and devastatingly real. Audience members had captured everything. Colbert's off-script question, Ben's razor-edged response, and the stunned silence that followed. One video posted just seconds after the segment ended racked up 100,000 views in an hour. By midnight, it had hit 2 million. The hashtag number sign Colbert Clash trended #1 on X, but it wasn't the kind of buzz the network had hoped for. Viewers were polarized. Some praised Colbert for finally asking what needed to be asked. Others, many more than expected, called the moment a disgusting ambush and accused the host of using personal hypotheticals as weapons. Comments poured in. "I came for laughs, not to watch a father get baited on national TV," wrote one viewer. Ben held his ground, Colbert lost his. Back inside the studio, the atmosphere remained tense long after the cameras stopped rolling. Audience members filed out slowly, whispering, arguing. One woman was overheard saying, "That wasn't entertainment. That was character assassination." A man near the exit added, "I've never seen Colbert that shaken. Shapiro? He didn't even flinch." And that was the part that disturbed some the most. Not that Ben had defended himself, but that he'd done so with surgical calm. Meanwhile, backstage chaos was erupting. Colbert's assistant, usually tasked with coordinating green room farewells and photo ops, now hovered near the host with a look of panic. "They're already clipping it," she whispered. "It's everywhere." Colbert said nothing. His face was stone, jaw tight. The confidence that had defined his brand looked dented, if not broken. The control he once had over every beat, every smirk, every applause line, gone in under 15 minutes. Ben, in contrast, left the studio calmly, trailed by his team. He didn't speak to press, didn't address the chaos, didn't pause for comments. But his phone was already vibrating. Calls from supporters, podcast producers, and fellow pundits. Invitations. Solidarity. He had walked into enemy territory and not only survived, he had dominated. Without rage, without insult, just resolve. And millions had watched it happen. Later that night, a leaked internal message revealed that CBS executives were evaluating the editorial direction of the show. Translation: damage control was in full swing. Advertisers were already asking questions. Sponsors were nervous. And the network's social media accounts were under siege. On Reddit, TikTok, and YouTube, users dissected every moment, every eyebrow twitch, every breath. What had started as a scheduled guest appearance had mutated into a media earthquake. Ben Shapiro had been expected to provide tension, controversy, maybe a viral clip. What he delivered was something far more dangerous to late-night television: a mirror. And what that mirror reflected back wasn't funny. It was fracture. And the shockwave had only just begun. While the internet exploded and social media churned with outrage and praise, behind the scenes at The Late Show, the mood was anything but composed. Stephen Colbert, fresh off what many were calling the most uncomfortable segment in the show's history, walked off stage with a stiff gait. The moment the curtains closed behind him, his posture sagged. He didn't speak, didn't look at anyone, just walked straight past his assistant and into his dressing room, slamming the door shut behind him. The producers, stunned, held a hasty huddle near the control booth. "That went too far," one of them muttered. Another replied, "He couldn't reel it back in." We'd lost the narrative. In truth, they hadn't just lost the narrative, they'd handed it to Ben Shapiro, live, without realizing it. Colbert had tried to provoke a soundbite. Instead, he got a masterclass in composure from a man he thought he could outmaneuver. And the cost? The very foundation of the show's power dynamic. Meanwhile, the staff was left scrambling. The segment that had just aired couldn't be cleaned up in post. There was no reshoot, no re-edit. The internet had already seized the raw version, unedited, unsanitized, unignorable. The team had no choice but to ride the wave, even as they tried frantically to reframe the moment. "We'll push the narrative that it was brave journalism," a marketing exec suggested, but even they didn't believe it. Colbert hadn't been brave. He'd been shaken. Inside the dressing room, Stephen Colbert sat alone in front of a mirror. The makeup lights buzzed faintly. He stared at his own reflection, face still flushed, tie loosened. The silence in the room was deafening. He ran a hand through his hair and muttered to no one in particular. "I shouldn't have gone there." But he had. And the audience saw it. Not just the millions at home, but the hundreds in the studio who had witnessed the transformation. The confident, affable host had unraveled into a cornered interrogator. Ben Shapiro, by contrast, hadn't lingered. He didn't need to. His job was done. He had been invited into the lion's den and walked out without a scratch. No handlers, no post-show spin. Just silence and strength. That silence spoke louder than any Twitter thread or cable news panel could. It wasn't just about who won the argument. It was about who kept their center when the lights grew hottest. And it wasn't Colbert. Calls poured in from network executives to the Late Show team. Damage containment, immediately. One exec asked, "Do we pull the full episode?" Another answered grimly, "It's too late." The internet already owns it. Staffers whispered about a forced apology segment. Writers brainstormed how to frame it. But no one had answers, because no joke could fix what had just happened. This wasn't a punchline gone wrong. It was a power shift in real time. And Colbert, once the king of clever comebacks, was suddenly just another man behind a desk, watching his control dissolve, one viral clip at a time. By sunrise the next morning, CBS was in full damage control. Executives convened to assess the firestorm. The confrontation between Ben Shapiro and Stephen Colbert wasn't just trending, it had overtaken the news cycle, and worse, it wasn't flattering. The guest kept his cool, one exec admitted. The host unraveled. Behind closed doors, the mood was bleak. Sponsors had begun reaching out, asking for clarity on future programming. Several advertisers suspended placements pending review. The financial implications weren't hypothetical, they were immediate. Staff were instructed not to comment. The show's social media feeds went quiet on the segment. Even within the entertainment industry, responses were split. Some defended Colbert's line of questioning. Others called it a cheap shot that backfired. That wasn't journalism, one showrunner said. It was a trap, one that the guest walked out of cleaner than the host. Writers at other shows took notes. If Colbert could be undone by his own questions, so could anyone. Stephen, meanwhile, remained silent. He skipped press events, didn't reference the segment, and appeared visibly tense in the following episode. The crowd noticed. The magic was missing. What had been intended as a moment of dominance had instead exposed a vulnerability, one the network could no longer spin. A guest had walked into the lion's den and left standing taller than the lion. And the media world was watching, nervously asking, who's really in control when the cameras start rolling? Ben Shapiro finally addressed the incident on his own platform, his podcast. No fireworks, no mockery, just a quiet opening line. Let's talk about what happened on The Late Show. It wasn't about retaliation. It was about clarity. He didn't dwell on Stephen Colbert's behavior. Instead, he dissected the moment. There's a difference between a real question and one meant to shame, he said. When someone brings your children into a debate, they're not looking for answers. They're trying to corner you. The comment echoed online, clips of it shared widely across ideological lines. Listeners responded quickly. Some agreed wholeheartedly, praising Ben's restraint. Others, even those who disagreed politically, admitted he kept his dignity under pressure. The story shifted again, from controversy to commentary. Ben wasn't escalating the conflict. He was reframing it. Colbert remained silent. The show didn't issue a statement. The contrast between the two men became the new story. One had fumbled and disappeared. The other had turned restraint into resonance. Ben ended his commentary with a single line. You don't need to shout to be heard. You just have to mean what you say. It landed. Because in a media environment often defined by spectacle, Ben had shown that control isn't about domination. It's about discipline. And in doing so, he flipped the narrative one final time. In the days that followed, the ripple effects were undeniable. Ratings for The Late Show dipped noticeably. Viewers flooded forums and comment sections with mixed reactions. But a common thread emerged. Something had shifted. Colbert's aura of control had cracked, and audiences saw it. Behind the scenes, things were even more turbulent. Show staff were told to avoid ideological guests for now. Scripts were double-checked. Writers were frustrated. We're not comedians anymore, one said. We're firefighters. Sponsors quietly backed away from upcoming episodes, and meetings were held to retool future bookings. Industry insiders began speculating whether Colbert's reputation would recover. This might be his Leno moment, said one producer. A defining slip. Meanwhile, Ben Shapiro continued his routine, unaffected. Invitations poured in from shows that once ignored him. Rival hosts saw an opportunity and moved quickly to book him. Ben declined most offers. He didn't need another confrontation, he already had the clip, the headlines, the moral upper hand. His silence became strategy, letting Colbert's misstep play out without adding fuel. What struck most people wasn't just that Ben survived the moment, it was how little effort he seemed to need to do it. No raised voice, no meltdown, just presence. And in that, he reminded an industry used to controlling the narrative that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply not fall into the trap, especially when the trap sets itself. In the weeks that followed, The Late Show returned to safer guests and lighter scripts, but the shadow of that night never fully left. The confrontation between Ben Shapiro and Stephen Colbert had become more than a viral moment. It was a mirror, a moment when the usual roles reversed and the audience saw it. Colbert's fans hoped for redemption, a return to form. But the laughter came slower, the confidence less sure. The show's tone subtly shifted, trying to find its footing again. Yet one question remained, unspoken but hanging in the air. What do you do when the format you mastered stops protecting you? Ben, for his part, never revisited the incident. He didn't need to. The clip had done its job. The public had decided. And more than that, so had the industry. Late-night hosts, once untouchable, were now seen as fallible. Not because of disagreement, but because of how easily one misstep could expose something deeper. Insecurity, bias, or fear. In the end, this wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about what happens when someone comes prepared, and the other doesn't. When one man sees the show for what it is, and the other believes he still controls the stage. So what do you think? Was Ben Shapiro justified in holding his ground, or did Colbert just ask the wrong question at the wrong time? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit that subscribe button, and tell me who you want covered next.